The First Modern War. Historians sometimes consider the Civil War the first modern war because it pioneered military technologies that have dominated warfare ever since. The rifle, with its greater range and accuracy, replaced the smooth-bore musket as the infantryman's primary weapon, thereby radically altering the tactics of ground combat. An early form of machine gun, the Gatling gun, first came into use during the Civil War as well. Lincoln supported the use of hot air balloons for aerial reconnaissance. Don't know what that means or how to say it. Thus hinting at a time when commanders would spy on enemy troops using more advanced technologies such as planes and satellites. The Confederates pioneered undersea warfare by constructing a primitive submarine that managed to sink a Union ship, though in the process it also sank itself. The ironclads, the Monitor and Virginia, had a more immediate effect on naval warfare. In the decades following the Civil War, most of the world's navies would armor their ships in iron or steel. Not only in its technology, but also in its savagery, the Civil War resembled the total wars of the 20th century. Sherman's march to the sea was perhaps the most dramatic instance, but both sides committed war crimes. Driven by racist fury that African Americans dared to fight against them, rebel soldiers frequently murdered black troops who surrendered. After one notorious massacre of black soldiers, Union troops killed 23 Confederate prisoners in revenge. Photographing the War, Matthew Brady. While new technologies made the Civil War the first modern war, not all of those technologies were weapons. The telegraph that allowed news to travel more quickly, making the Civil War the first war that reporters covered in a widespread way. The Civil War also brought something else new to wartime: photographs from the front. Back in the 1830s, a Frenchman named Louis J. M. Daguerre developed the first practical form of photography. His subjects had to sit still for 20 minutes to produce an image called a daguerreotype. By the time of the Civil War, photography had advanced beyond Daguerre's early efforts, but journalists still had to haul big, clumsy cameras to the front. Many of the remarkable documentary images from the war were taken by teams of photographers, hired and directed by Matthew Brady, a successful portrait photographer in New York and Washington. Brady had studied the technology of the daguerreotype. He understood the potential power of photography in recording history and influencing public opinion. Hampered by poor vision, Brady took few photographs of himself, but he sent his teams to follow the armies of the Civil War and capture thousands of unforgettable pictures of soldiers and officers working, resting, preparing for battle, and, in some cases, dying. The gritty, sometimes horrifying photographs made it possible, for the first time, for civilians far from the battlefield to see the stark reality of war. Transforming government. As perhaps the first modern war, the Civil War also saw changes in government that furthered the development of the United States as a modern industrial nation. To sustain its war effort, the North pumped enormous sums of money into vital war industries. Lincoln's administration vastly expanded federal government powers in the federal budget. During the war, the Union enacted the first income tax, driven by the vast cost of waging the war. The federal budget swelled from $66 million in 1863 to $1.3 billion in 1865. Jeepers. The war years saw the creation of both a national banking system and a national currency, though some people preferred gold and silver to the new paper bills called greenbacks. In 1862, Congress, at the time firmly controlled by Republicans since the secession of the South, passed three ambitious programs that would have an enormous effect on the development of American society in the decades ahead. The Homestead Act set off a post-war surge of settlement by granting 160 acres of free land in the West to any settler who lived on his parcel for 5 years and made improvements on it. The Pacific Railroad Act authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad stretching to California, which would help knit together the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Finally, the Morrill Act provided each loyal state with land for public colleges. By giving less affluent Americans access to a college education, the Morrill Act advanced social mobility. Together, these federal programs fed the engine of geographic and economic expansion that, by the 1880s, would transform the United States into the world's greatest industrial power. April 1865. April 14th, 1865 was Good Friday, the day on which Christians commemorate the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Lincoln left his desk early to take a carriage ride with his wife, who found him cheerful, almost joyous, now that the long war had ended. In the evening, the Lincolns went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to see a comedy. They settled into the presidential box, with Lincoln laughing heartily at the action on stage. In the middle of the play, John Wilkes Booth, an actor and a fanatical partisan of the Southern cause, slipped quietly into the box. Booth, who violently hated Lincoln, had already taken part in a failed plot to kidnap the president. As Lincoln leaned forward to watch the play, Booth pulled out a small pistol, aimed it at the back of the president's head, and pulled the trigger. Lincoln slumped into his wife's arms. Booth managed to escape by leaping to the stage and running out of the rear of the theater. Some in the audience initially thought this was all part of the play. The president was carried to a nearby house where he died the following morning. Across the country, people were stunned with grief. Hundreds of African Americans gathered in front of the White House to mourn the death of the man who had ended slavery. After lying in state at the Capitol, Lincoln's casket went by train to his home in Springfield, Illinois, stopping at cities along the way. Millions of people turned out to pay their last respects. In his elegy for Lincoln, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed," the poet Walt Whitman described the coffin that passes through lanes and streets, through day and night, with a great cloud darkening the land. He concluded by calling the murdered president the sweetest, wisest soul of all my days and lands. Lincoln's death left the reunited nation bereft of his wise leadership, even as it faced massive new challenges. The Civil War had changed the United States in profound ways. 4 million people, once enslaved, were now free. Over the course of the war, economic power shifted definitively to the North, while vast portions of the South lay in ruins. The federal government in Washington grew in size and assumed sweeping new powers. The war also spurred the development of new industries, railroad construction, and agricultural growth. America in 1865 was on the verge of a major economic expansion that would fundamentally transform the face of the nation. Still, many questions remained unanswered. What could be done to reintegrate hundreds of thousands of soldiers into civilian life? How could the country, and especially the South, where most of the battles were fought, recover from the physical and economic devastation caused by the war? Above all, what would become of the 4 million enslaved people liberated by the war and the 13th Amendment? It remained to be seen if Lincoln's successors could bring about the just and lasting peace that he had yearned for. Women and the Civil War, Homefront, a historical close-up. While the history of wars often focus on political developments and conflicts on the battlefield, wars also affect civilians on the home front. In the Civil War, as men headed off to the battlefield in record numbers, women in both the North and the South bore new burdens and faced new challenges. Women, along with children and older men, had to adjust to a new world where most fighting-age men were off at war. What did they do, and how were their lives changed? The emotional burden. Perhaps the heaviest burden for those on the home front was the emotional drain of worry over family members on the battlefield. More than 600,000 men died during the war, most on distant battlefields or in remote hospitals. These losses, and the fears that mounted when news from the battlefield was slow to arrive, took an enormous toll on women in both the North and South. Most women could read and write, and they poured out their emotions in letters to loved ones away at war. "I think my heart will break," one woman wrote to her sweetheart. "I worry so much about you. I cannot sleep sound no more. I waken up at night and lay for hours wondering if I shall ever see my pet again." When they learned that a son or husband had been wounded or fallen ill, some women obtained passes and traveled to military hospitals to care for their family members, and when the worst news came, some took it upon themselves to travel great distances to bring home the bodies of fallen loved ones. Jane Deans of Philadelphia left 4 children at home and journeyed all the way to Virginia with her newborn to retrieve the body of her husband. For many women in the South, the emotional burden of war was not just anxiety over distant loved ones, but fear for their own lives. When the South was invaded, Southern women who lived on or near the field of battle were in harm's way, especially in cities like New Orleans, Vicksburg, Atlanta, and Richmond. Working to make ends meet. Beyond emotional heartache, women had to find ways to make ends meet with men away at war. Army salaries were modest, and even with support with neighbors and communities, many women had to take on new jobs. Farmers' wives were accustomed to hard work, but now they found themselves taking on tasks and making decisions that men had traditionally made, deciding what crops to plant, which animals to slaughter, or, in the South, how to manage slave workers. Working-class women in northern towns and cities found that the war opened new employment opportunities. Some worked as seamstresses, sewing uniforms for government contractors. Others took jobs in munitions factories, whose owners came to value the care and skill that women brought to the delicate and dangerous task of filling cartridges. In Washington, federal officials turned to women to take on traditionally male jobs as clerks in the Treasury Department and other offices. Challenges for African American women. African American women faced additional challenges, both financial and emotional. African Americans who enlisted were not paid as much as white soldiers, so they had less to send home to their families. In many northern cities, such as Philadelphia and Washington, black women who wished to travel to visit their husbands in military camps were barred from streetcars or forced to ride on exposed platforms rather than in the enclosed cars. Southern black women who had escaped from slavery languished in what were called contraband camps, where freed people lived under Union military protection while the men were at war. In many cases, women remained enslaved throughout the war, even when their husbands had managed to escape and enlist in the Union Army. Caring for the sick and wounded. Before the Civil War, women traditionally cared for sick family members, but the medical profession was dominated by men. Although Elizabeth Blackwell had earned a medical license, very few women had access to the formal medical training that professional doctors received. And nursing was still a male occupation. Many in both the North and the South felt it was inappropriate for women, and especially younger unmarried women, to be around sick or wounded men outside their own families. The Civil War changed these attitudes, opening doors to medical work for women, especially in the North. When the war broke out, Abraham Lincoln turned to Dorothy Dix, who had achieved fame for her work with the mentally ill, as the superintendent of Union Army nurses. Dix quickly set about creating a professional nursing corps. When a female clerk at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington learned of the suffering of wounded Union troops, she collected medical supplies and went to care for the soldiers on the battlefield. Before long, this clerk, Clara Barton, had found a whole new calling. After the Civil War in 1881, she founded the American branch of the International Red Cross. In the South, while many women were hesitant to enter hospital wards, others rejected cultural conventions and threw themselves into nursing, both at home and in battlefield hospitals. After the First Battle of Bull Run, Sally Tompkins opened a hospital in Richmond, which she ran throughout the war. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was so impressed with her work that he gave her a military commission as a captain of cavalry. In both North and South, thousands of women who followed news of the war's progress at home supported the war effort in any way they could. As soon as fighting broke out, they formed sewing circles and other voluntary societies to support their troops. Women rolled bandages, sewed clothing, or prepared packages stuffed with food, newspapers, and anything else that the military did not supply. They made flags for use in battle. Before long, they were organizing visits to local hospitals, where volunteers read to soldiers and did their best to offer aid and comfort. In the North, which enjoyed much greater wealth than the South, women staffed two national organizations, the United States Sanitary Commission, USSC, and the United States Christian Commission, USCC. The USSC sent medical and sanitary aid to the camps, while USCC agents delivered religious materials and food and clothing. These national groups had local auxiliaries in towns and cities across the North, where volunteers, mostly women, raised money to send goods to soldiers in the camps. In the second half of the war, women of the Sanitary Commission staged a series of impressive fundraising fairs. These fairs became grand celebrations of patriotism, where visitors could view a wide variety of exhibits while purchasing items to help raise money. The New York Fair alone raised over $1 million. The organizers of Chicago's Northwestern Sanitary Fair, one of the first and largest, got Abraham Lincoln to donate an autographed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, which sold at auction for $3,000. Writing and speaking out. Other women found more political ways to support the cause. Hundreds of women wrote newspaper editorials and letters to the editor, expressing their opinions even if they sometimes did not sign their full names. Diaries and letters reveal that in sitting rooms and meeting halls across the country, many other women engaged in spirited arguments about politics and the war. A few, notably the young Quaker Philadelphian Anna Dixon, became patriotic lecturers during the war. Known as America's Joan of Arc for her youthful vigor and sharp tongue, Dickinson attracted enormous crowds and periodic controversy. After a disastrous showing by Union troops in one battle, she declared that this battle was not lost through ignorance or incompetence, but through the treason of the commanding general George B. McClellan. Pro-war Republicans loved her fiery oratory, but some Democratic newspapers insisted that a woman had no place speaking in public. Women as soldiers and spies. Several hundred women went so far as to dress as men and serve in uniform. In a few cases, their true identities were not discovered until years after the war. Others took advantage of their gender to befriend enemy officers and then bring news of enemy movements to officers on the other side. Often they simply passed on news that they happened to overhear, but in a handful of celebrated cases, women in both the North and South served as highly successful spies, passing valuable information across enemy lines. Early in the war, Washington resident Rose O'Neal Greenhow passed information about Union movements to Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard before First Bull Run. Greenhow was arrested and held in prison before federal officials banished her to Richmond, where she was welcomed as a heroine. Virginia native Elizabeth Van Lew spent the war living in Richmond's high society while secretly aiding Northern prisoners of war and passing military information across the lines to the Union military. Women and dissent. Not all Northerners sided with the Union, and not all white Southerners supported the Confederacy. Many in the North objected to the war, or at least opposed the draft, emancipation, and other government actions. As the war dragged on, growing numbers of Southerners objected to Confederate policies. Wherever there was dissent, women took part, both in their private writings and in occasional public resistance. In April 1863, Richmond erupted in bread riots over the cost of food and accusations that merchants were hoarding their goods. Most accounts agree that women were chiefly responsible for these and other food riots. When rioters in New York City objected to the draft in July 1863, many of those arrested were women, many of whom had draft-age sons. The war's legacy for women. What sort of legacy did the war leave for American women? Some occupations, particularly nursing, remained open to women after the war, and war widows, like surviving veterans, began to receive modest pensions from the federal government after the war. In some ways, the war indirectly changed women's roles in the long term. The war accelerated the growth of industry in the North in the post-war period. Increasing numbers of women In some ways, the war indirectly changed women's roles in the long term. The war accelerated the growth of industry in the North, and in the post-war period, increasing numbers of women found work in the nation's factories and workshops. By the 1880s and 1890s, many women were also attending college and playing an active role in civic and volunteer associations, a development that might have taken longer had the war not challenged long-standing ideas about women's place in society.